Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Dr. Diego Granera, and I am an economics professor at Villanova University. I'm also a member of the Ethical Society, so you might just know me as Diego. The first time that I ever taught a college class in graduate school was at University of Washington in Seattle, 9 years ago now. And I remember that I sat down in the front of the room as the students were filing in, just welcoming them as they were walking in. And I remember telling them, oh, we'll just start in just a moment. Just give it a few moments. When it was finally time, I stood up, I went to the front of the room, and I started by saying, bueno, bienvenidos todos a la clase de microeconomía en español. Repito, esta es la clase de microeconomía en español. Espero que todos estén en el lugar correcto. And then I stopped. The faces of panic. Panic for knowing just enough Spanish to not quite know what was going to happen. And then, of course, I said, no, I do speak English. No worries here. And everyone laughed as they sighed a sigh of relief. And that way the ice was broken. And I'm happy to say that the reason why I got to do that was not despite being an immigrant, but because I was an immigrant. It is an honor to stand before you today in this room, shaped by ideas, bound by inquiry, and inspired by compassion. As an immigrant, as an economist, and as a learner in the values of ethical humanism, I am beyond grateful for the opportunity to share with you some reflections on one of the most urgent issues of our time, immigration, and more specifically, the corrosive, self-destructive nature of anti-immigrant rhetoric. I was born and raised in Costa Rica, a country in Central America, a region brimming with culture, contradiction, creativity, and conflict. I've spent 14 out of the last 20 years of my life in the United States, not as a refugee, not as someone fleeing war or persecution, but first as an undergraduate student at Yale University, then as a doctoral student, like I mentioned, at University of Washington, and now as a university professor at Villanova. And I should admit that my path to citizenship was in many ways a very fortunate one, since I did it through my wife, who was a citizen by birth, my wife of 9 years, and this made my legal transition more straightforward than others. And yet, it still took me over 5 years and over $8,000 in legal fees, in application fees, in medical fees. It also included almost getting deported during the process of adjusting my status. So, unless you've lived through that process, unless you've gone through the path of first getting your permanent residency, green card, and eventually getting citizenship, people truly do not know just how difficult it is and how incredibly complex our legal immigration process can be. I tell you this not to fish for sympathy, but to underscore the complexity, the stress, and the sheer monetary cost of becoming a US citizen. Even for those who, like me, had a relatively easier time. Had I pursued permanent residency and then citizenship through my job or through the green card lottery, I might still be waiting. People wait for over 20 years, up to 20 years to get to migrate legally into the US. This is not a process that is meant to be welcoming. It is deliberately designed as an obstacle. And not only do many not make it through, but the complexity of the process even creates the incentive to not even try to go about it the quote-unquote right way. In fact, it only suffices to know a bit of immigration history to know that before the 1910s, before the first major immigration laws in the US, legal immigration solely consisted in just showing up. So long as you just made it to Ellis Island, so long as you were not very visibly sick, you just had to write your name in, and that was it. Welcome, you're a legal migrant. Yet, even while navigating this labyrinth, I felt the hope that has drawn so many before me. The United States has long been seen as a land of opportunity. And it is that dream, more than the bureaucracy, that keeps the idea of the United States alive for many millions around the world. But today, that idea is under assault. In recent years, anti-immigrant rhetoric has moved from the shadows of extremist circles into the mainstream of political discourse. We have heard of invasions, of building walls, of banning entire nationalities from entry. We have seen the cruel separation of families, the caging of children, and the deployment of armed forces to southern borders, not to aid asylum seekers, but to deter and punish them. Much of this rhetoric was amplified by the Trump administration, but we still need to be clear on something, and that is that nativism is not something that is new. In fact, anti-immigrant sentiment has haunted this country since its inception. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Irish immigrants were portrayed as violent drunks. Italians were accused of being criminals and anarchists and papists. Polish and Eastern European Jews were deemed racially inferior, too foreign to assimilate. They were not considered white in the way that we understand whiteness today. In fact, laws such as the Immigration Act of 1924 explicitly limited the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, driven by the desire to preserve what was then perceived as the racial and cultural purity of the United States. Does this sound familiar? History repeats itself, not because we forget it, but because we fail to learn from it. Let me ask some questions. When you visit a hospital and receive a life-saving diagnosis aided by an MRI machine, do you think of Dr. Raymond Damadian, the son of Armenian immigrants? When you pull out your iPhone, do you think of Steve Jobs, the child of a Syrian immigrant? When you enjoy a symphony, do you think perhaps this conductor was trained under Leonard Bernstein, whose family came from Ukraine? When you take insulin, do you know that the Nobel Prize-winning discovery of insulin was brought to clinical use by in part by the Romanian-born scientist Nicolae Paulescu? When your grandkids, study algebra in school, do you know that the word itself comes from Arabic, al-jabr, brought to the West by scholars in Islamic Spain who translated ancient Greek that would otherwise have been lost? Immigrants are not merely contributors. They are foundational. Science, medicine, technology, music, literature, Food. These are not American despite being shaped by immigrants. They are American because they are shaped by immigrants. Nowhere is this more evident than in our economy. As an economics professor, I must rely not only on principles on justice and humanism, but also on data. And the data tell quite the clear story. Immigrants are a net positive for the economy. They start businesses at rates higher than natural-born citizens. They pay taxes, yes. Even undocumented immigrants pay taxes through sales taxes, property taxes, and directly through rent. Income taxes under usually borrowed Social Security numbers. They fill in labor shortages in agriculture, caregiving, STEM fields, hospitality. They innovate. They patent. They invest. A 2019 report by the National Academy of Sciences found that immigration has a positive impact on long-term economic growth. High-skilled immigrants, particularly in the fields of software engineering and biotechnology, are a key reason why the United States has maintained its technological edge. 1 in 4 startups in the US, worth over $1 billion, had a founder who was an immigrant. Think of companies like Google, Tesla, Moderna, vaccines, anyone? Yet, despite this, anti-immigrant rhetoric continues to thrive, in part due to the central role that racism plays in anti-immigrant attitudes. Racism undergirds the arguments that seek to divide deserving immigrants from the undeserving ones. And it defines who is seen as a threat versus who is seen as an asset. Why is it that immigrants from predominantly white countries are rarely targeted in the same way that immigrants from the global south? Why are Latinx and Black immigrants disproportionately criminalized and detained? Is it a coincidence that our president has mused about why we must accept immigrants from, and I'm quoting here, shithole countries, and not more from places like Norway? This is no coincidence. Anti-immigrant rhetoric is often a thin veil for racism. When politicians demonize illegal immigrants, they rely on images carefully crafted to evoke fear. Images of brown faces, of poor families, of people who speak unfamiliar languages. Español, por ejemplo. But those images are not neutral, they are racialized. And they tap into a long history of white supremacy that defines American identity as something inherently white, preferably, the kind from Western and Northern Europe, preferably Protestant, and preferably if their ancestors first migrated here a few centuries ago. Now, the reason why we should care about this is that most recently, the current administration has taken the extra step of combining these attitudes with practices that violate the very principles of due process and justice. Let me be specific. Today, under a legal maneuver, undocumented immigrants, even those seeking asylum, are being forcibly expelled, not into their countries of origin, but into third countries, where their safety might not necessarily be guaranteed. Imagine being a child, waking up one morning to find that your parent has been taken by an ICE agent. Imagine fleeing violence in El Salvador, like it was the case for Kilmar Abrego Garcia, only to be apprehended and deported to what amounts to a foreign gulag, despite having a non-deportation legal order since 2019. It is 2025. Imagine having survived the treacherous journey to the US in search for a better life, only to be sent to prison in a country where gangs kill with impunity. Scary stuff. These are not abstract stories. These are the stories of actual people, actually living around us. People with names, with families, with dreams, our neighbors. People who come seeking refuge to the US are sent back into peril without hearings, without access to legal representation, without the chance to present their case. And this should worry us all. Because when the government denies due process to the most vulnerable, it sets a precedent that can eventually affect everyone. When rights become conditional based on status, origin, language, none of our rights are truly secure. Due process is not a luxury, shouldn't be. It is a cornerstone of our democracy. And its erosion in the name of immigration control is a direct threat to the rule of law. We must speak out before it is too late. In the words of the late Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller, written in 1946 as a way of atoning for having supported the Nazi government in Germany, you've probably heard these words before. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak out for me. Now, even if for a moment we ignored the human aspect of the situation, as difficult as that might be, as an economist, hopefully I can sway you. I hope that I can sway you as to the material costs of this injustice. Detaining, deporting, and persecuting immigrants is not just cruel, it's just expensive and inefficient. The Department of Homeland Security spends billions of taxpayer dollars each year on detention centers, border militarization, and enforcement raids, money that could have been invested in schools, in healthcare, in infrastructure, and the human cost, incalculable. Is this what we stand for? Let me ask you something else. When you sing, "This land is your land," do you realize that Woody Guthrie wrote it in response to economic equality, imagining a country where no one would be excluded? When you walk through the city of Philadelphia, do you see the architecture, the food, the people, all the layers of history shaped by generations of newcomers? This is our shared story, and to deny it is to deny ourselves. So why does anti-immigrant rhetoric persist, despite all the evidence to the contrary? Because it is politically convenient. It is a scapegoat for the failings of capitalism, says The Economist, of inequality, of neglect. It is easier to blame immigrants than it is to tackle systemic injustice. It's easier to divide the working class than it is to empower it. It's easier to evoke fear than to inspire solidarity. Immigration is not just an economic issue. It is an emotional one, as it touches on identity, on fear, on narratives of scarcity and control. Politicians know this. They stoke fear, not because it is true, but because it is effective. But we can do better than that. We must do better than that. The United States I believe in, the United States that many of you believe in, it is not one of exclusion, but of expansion. It is not weakened by diversity, but strengthened by it. Our culture, our economy, our democracy, they all depend on our willingness to include rather than exclude. In economic terms, immigration is a growth engine. Immigrants not only take jobs, which primarily in sectors where natural-born US Americans do not want, such as hospitality, construction, agriculture, but they also create them, and they create demand. They drive consumption, and they bring about innovation. They are younger on average, which helps offset the aging of the natural-born population. Immigrants, they are indispensable. Restricting immigration is like choking off the oxygen supply to a growing organism. You might slow the rise of population, but you also slow down growth, dynamism, and resilience. It turns away talent. It undermines our labor culture. It increases our national debt. It forces families into the shadows. It contradicts our professed values. And most of all, it robs us of the opportunity to build a future based on inclusion and justice. Let us not fall for the false dichotomy that says that we must choose between security and compassion. The two are not mutually exclusive. We can have secure borders and humane policies. We can have laws and still show mercy. But to do so, we must change the narrative. We must reject the language of us versus them. We must reject the myth that the United States is full. We must reject the idea that immigrants are threats. Instead, we must tell the truth. Immigrants are us. They are our past, our present, and our future. So yes, anti-immigrant rhetoric is self-defeating, and the fear of immigrants makes us forget who we are. The founding ideals of this country, the ideas of liberty, of equality, of self-determination, are not confined to one race, one religion, or one language. They are moral aspirations, not demographic descriptors. And if we are to live up to those ideals, we must remember that Felix Adler, the founder of the ethical culture movement, what Felix Adler, founder of the ethical movement, stood for. Adler taught that the worth of a person is not determined by status, nationality, or race, but by their capacity for moral action. His vision was a universal one: to turn away immigrants, especially the most vulnerable, is to turn away from that vision. Ethical humanism demands that we see each other not as threats, but as fellow travelers in the human condition. It demands that we extend dignity, not just to those who look like us, but to all who suffer, those who strive, those who dream. I do not deny that immigration comes with challenges. Any honest account must grapple with issues of integration, of labor market competition in localized sectors, cultural friction. In fact, I regularly tell my students that almost any socioeconomic issue that they can think of is far more complex and nuanced than the politicians will have them believe. But these are problems to be solved, not excuses for cruelty. Divided, we fall. Anti-immigrant rhetoric does not only hurt immigrants, it erodes the moral and economic foundations of the society that hosts it. It makes us smaller, poorer, meaner. It tells children who grow up speaking two languages at home that they are less than, that they're less American. It tells workers that their unemployment is the fault of the brown man. not the broken economic system. It tells citizens that their strength comes not from unity in diversity, but from walls and bans and suspicion. This is a lie. And like all lies, it costs us dearly. Imagine a future in which immigration is not feared, but embraced, where the engineer from India and the nurse from Haiti and the artist from Venezuela and the farm worker from Guatemala are not exceptions to be tolerated, but neighbors to be welcomed. Imagine a policy that sees immigration not as a problem, but as a source of national renewal. Imagine reform that is humane, efficient, just. Imagine a country that lives up to its promise. I believe that future is possible. But we must fight for it, not just in the courtrooms or Congress, but in conversations like this, and in the classrooms, and in the voting booths, and around dinner tables. So the next time that someone tells you that immigrants are a drain, ask them how they feel about Google Maps, developed by a Danish immigrant. Ask them how they feel about the polio vaccine, brought to millions thanks to the work of Albert Sabin, born in Poland. Ask them about Irving Berlin, the Russian-born composer of iconic American songs like God Bless America and White Christmas. Or Salvador Dali, the Spanish-born surrealist artist, whose work have had a lasting impact on American art and culture. Or Yo-Yo Ma, the French-born American cellist to Chinese parents, who has significantly contributed to contemporary classical music. Or Lin-Manuel Miranda, the Puerto Rican artist, creator of the groundbreaking musical Hamilton, which has reshaped American musical theater. Or Eero Saarinen, the Finnish-born American architect known for his sculptural designs, such as the Gateway Arch in Missouri. Or Frank Gehry, the Canadian-born American architect known for his buildings, such as the Guggenheim Bilbao Museum. Or Luis Diego Granera, the natural-born American economist, who just shared some thoughts with you on immigration. Ask them, in short, how they feel about the United States, because that is what is at stake. To close, in a quote that is usually attributed to Felix Adler, the place where man's humanity first becomes vividly real to him is the place where the suffering of another being touches his heart and awakens his will to help. Let us not harden our hearts. Let us not fall for easy answers and ugly scapegoats. Let us not be divided, because divided we fall. Thank you very much.